Years spent in prison, a crime that clung to him, and a confession with no way back. But the truth never stays buried forever. A psychologist, a prisoner, and secrets lurking in the shadows of the past. Who is the savior and who is the criminal? When the truth is revealed, everything will change. Mia was in the final stage of her Ph.D. in psychology. After years of hard work, this research in forensic psychology would be a turning point in her career. She had been studying the psychological profiles of criminals in prisons for a long time, but now she had reached the most critical phase, conducting one-on-one interviews with high-profile criminals. These criminals were known for their horrifying crimes. She had specifically chosen them. Her goal was to gain a deeper understanding of criminal psychology and contribute to projects that could help reduce crime rates in society. She was excited to be at the final stage of her research, but there was also a slight tension inside her. Early in the morning, she packed her bag, fixed her hair, and took one last look in the mirror. Today was a big day. She got into her car and headed to the prison. When she arrived at the high-security facility, she noticed her breath turning into mist in the cold winter air. As she stepped out of the car, she thought to herself, I've come this far. There's no turning back now. At the prison entrance, she took out her ID and passed through security. The officers escorted her inside to meet the prison warden. The warden gave her a serious look. The criminals here are not ordinary inmates, Miss Mia. Be careful. We've taken all the necessary security measures, but nothing is ever guaranteed. Mia nodded in acknowledgement. She was aware of the risks, but this study was crucial to her. The warden informed her that 2 armed guards would accompany her at all times during the interviews and instructed them not to leave her side for even a second. The first phase of her research would take place in a quiet interrogation room, while the second phase would involve interviews in the open area among the prisoners. She wanted to analyze their psychological responses in different environments. When she began her first interview, she was surprised to find that the man was more polite than she had expected. He didn't speak like a dangerous criminal who had been locked up for years, but rather like someone who had been imprisoned by mistake. Mia asked directly, "Do you regret it?" The man nodded without hesitation. "Yes," he said, his voice soft. He has the ability to show empathy, at least on the surface, Mia thought. But to truly understand what he felt, she needed to move on to the second phase. The interview in the yard was completely different. Despite being surrounded by iron fences, the prison yard looked peaceful under the falling snow. But Mia knew this peace was only an illusion. The prisoner, bundled up in his thick coat to protect himself from the cold, faced her as she repeated the same question. "Do you regret it?" she asked again. This time the man hesitated. He looked up at the sky, then at the other inmates around him. Finally he shrugged and said, "I don't know." This was a crucial finding for Mia. Why would a criminal express regret when alone but react differently in front of others? This could be evidence of how social environments influence criminals. If studied further, findings like this could lead to major projects aimed at reducing crime rates. But then, something interrupted Mia's thoughts. Some of the surrounding inmates had slowly started moving toward them. At first they were just watching. But soon whispering began. One of the guards leaned in and reassured Mia, "Don't worry, we have the situation under control." But Mia's eyes locked onto one of the approaching prisoners. His gaze was different from the others. The guards immediately went on high alert, their hands resting on their weapons as they carefully moved toward the inmates. But Mia felt it instinctively, something was wrong. And soon the moment arrived. One of the most dangerous prisoners in the facility was about to make his move. No one even realized how the fight had started. One moment, everything was normal. The next, chaos erupted. In the blink of an eye, a prisoner had lunged at one of the guards. The guard stumbled backward but managed to reach for his gun and fire a shot. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the prison yard as one of the inmates collapsed, injured. But instead of diffusing the tension, it ignited a full-blown riot. The other inmates sprang into action. The wounded guard was quickly swallowed up by the crowd. His colleague rushed to help, trying to draw his weapon, but the prisoners were already on him. Within seconds he was pinned to the ground, struggling as the inmates wrestled his gun away. From the watchtowers above, the guards went on high alert. Sirens blared. Security teams rushed toward the yard, but Mia's fear was growing. This wasn't just random violence, this was a plan. At that moment, the inmate she had been interviewing caught a gun thrown to him by another prisoner. Mia's eyes widened in shock. Instinct took over and she sprinted toward the fence. She had to get away. But it was too late. A strong arm suddenly wrapped around her neck, yanking her back with force. Her breath hitched. Cold metal pressed against her temple. By the time the guards reached the yard, Most of the prisoners had backed off, watching from the sidelines. But Mia had been taken hostage, placed at the center of their escape plan. The man holding her took a step forward, shouting at the guards in a firm, demanding voice, "We have conditions. All of us. If you don't comply, the woman dies." Despite the panic rising inside her, Mia forced herself to stay calm. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she tried to steady her breathing. She whispered to the prisoner holding her, "I thought you said you regretted it." The man smirked coldly, leaning in to whisper in her ear, "I've been waiting a week for this. Go ahead, add this to your fancy thesis." Mia's stomach turned. She had walked straight into a trap. The warden's voice rang out, sharp and unwavering, "You're in no position to negotiate. Drop the act." But the inmate didn't budge. His finger rested on the trigger and he looked completely sure of himself. As the cold wind swept through the yard, everyone's fate now hinged on Mia's life. The guards swiftly moved in, cuffing the inmates one by one. Those who resisted were forced to the ground and restrained. But Mia was still a hostage, and the prisoner holding her kept his finger firmly on the trigger. The man shouted angrily, "Stop cuffing the prisoners, or the woman dies." The warden and the guards froze. His voice echoed through the prison yard. "Our demands are simple for you. 2 extra hours in the yard every day. We want the same access as the rookies. We eat the same meals. We get the same rights." The warden clenched his jaw, locking eyes with the prisoner. "You're not just a petty thief," he said coldly. "I can't put you in the same category as them." The inmate let out a dark chuckle. "But you put me in the same place as this sweet doctor," he said, tightening his grip around Mia's neck and pulling her closer. Her breath hitched. Then his voice rose even louder. "And I have a personal request. My wife. Bring my wife here. Now. Or the doctor dies." The warden took a deep breath. He had no choice but to negotiate. He needed time. Meanwhile, prison officials had already called the police for outside reinforcement. But inside, the situation was spiraling out of control. As the guards carefully inched closer to Mia and the prisoner, the other inmates noticed. They quickly gathered around, standing ready to attack. Their eyes were filled with menace. Once again, the prisoner's furious voice rang through the yard. "We want to be treated like human beings. We want the same meals you give the rookies. The same time outside. Bring my wife here." The demands kept piling up. Mia tried to control her breathing, but she realized she couldn't feel her legs. She was staring death in the face. Everything could turn in an instant. The warden, the guards, the approaching police backup. The tension was unbearable. Now the only question remained, how would this nightmare end? There was only one person who could end this crisis. Another inmate, Daniel. Unlike the other prisoners, he was different. Amid the chaos, he waited silently, watching as the guards distracted the other inmates. Slowly, he inched closer to Mia and the man holding her hostage. At that moment, he noticed something. The grip on the gun had loosened. The hostage-taker's fingers had grown tired. This was his chance. He moved in less than a second. With a swift, forceful motion, he twisted the man's wrist upward. A sharp cry of pain echoed as the gun flew into the air and clattered to the ground. For a brief moment, everyone froze. Seizing the opportunity, Daniel grabbed Mia and yanked her back, pulling her into a sprint. At the same time, he shouted in a commanding voice, "Get down now." Mia instinctively dropped to the ground. Daniel immediately shielded her with his body. Gunshots erupted in all directions. The air filled with deafening cracks of bullets and desperate screams. A sudden sharp pain shot through Mia's leg. A burning sensation spread as she gasped in agony. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the chaos. The guards moved in swiftly, taking down the inmates one by one. Police reinforcements had already stormed through the prison gates. The yard had turned into a battlefield. Minutes felt like hours. But as the inmates fell one after another, silence finally took over. The gunfire ceased. Daniel took a deep breath and dropped to his knees beside Mia. Gently, he cradled her head in his lap, scanning her face. Her eyelids were growing heavy. "No, don't close your eyes," he murmured. One glance at her leg and he knew she'd been shot. Without wasting a second, he tore the sleeve of his prison uniform in one swift motion, wrapping the fabric tightly around her wound to create a tourniquet. Just then, a guard rushed up behind him, slamming him to the ground. Daniel didn't resist. His hands were forced behind his back, and the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Lying there, Daniel locked eyes with Mia. Her consciousness was slipping. "She's losing too much blood. Tighten the tourniquet," he shouted. Guards and medics swarmed around Mia, urgency in their every move. The entire prison yard stood in stunned silence. Blood stained the snow, a deep crimson mark on the battlefield. When Mia opened her eyes, the bright white light in the room stung her vision. Where was she? For a few seconds her mind was blank. But then, memories rushed back in waves: the prison yard, the inmates' attack, the moment she was taken hostage. And then, a deep unease settled in her chest as her breathing grew uneven. She felt a dull ache in her leg. She was still here. She was still alive. Just then the door opened and a doctor walked in. "You went through something intense," he said, giving her a reassuring look. "You lost a lot of blood, but you're going to be okay." Mia locked eyes with him. "Thank you," she whispered. But the questions in her mind wouldn't let her rest. She took a deep breath, hesitating before she spoke. "Doctor?" The doctor lifted his head slightly, waiting for her to continue. "If someone had told me I might be taken hostage on my way to the prison, I would have believed it," Mia said. "But being rescued by another inmate? That's strange. And considering he must be a high-profile criminal to even be there." The doctor let out a quiet sigh, closing the file in his hands and stepping closer to her bedside. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "you find people with a conscience in the most unexpected places." Mia paused, the words lingering in her mind. She saw it again, Daniel shielding her in the middle of the gunfire. But why? The doctor seemed to read her expression. "You're a professional psychologist, so I probably don't need to say this," he continued, "but don't forget about Stockholm Syndrome. Try not to dwell too much on your rescuer." Mia took a deep breath, but the storm inside her hadn't settled. The doctor kept going. "You're all over the news. Once you leave here, you'll be bombarded with questions. My advice as a doctor? Stay quiet. Keep your mind away from this mess." Mia slowly nodded, but deep down she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The doctor hesitated for a moment, then gave her one last piece of advice. "Also, I strongly recommend you seek professional help for PTSD. Experiences like this leave more of a mark than people realize." Mia closed her eyes. She had thought it was all over. But when questions remain unanswered, nothing is ever truly over. The moment Mia was discharged from the hospital, her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Call after call flashed across the screen. Her family, her friends, and the media. Everyone wanted to talk to her. But Mia silenced her phone and ignored them all. She wasn't ready. When she returned home, everything was supposed to feel the same. But it didn't. Her belongings were right where she had left them, yet something inside her had shifted. Leaning on her crutches for support, she made her way to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water and took a deep breath. But her mind refused to stay quiet. She moved to the living room and turned on the TV. Flipping through the channels, she suddenly saw herself on the screen. Psychologist Mia Thompson, the survivor of a prison hostage crisis. And the inmate she owes her life to, Daniel Matthews. Mia's fingers trembled as she tightened her grip on the remote. Her heart pounded as she watched. A photo of Daniel appeared on the screen. A former general surgeon. Now a convicted felon. Mia narrowed her eyes. Daniel Matthews. A highly trained doctor. But why was he in prison? The news anchor continued. Daniel Matthews was once a prestigious surgeon. But the reason he's behind bars? His alleged involvement in an international organ trafficking ring. Mia felt the blood drain from her face. She set the water glass down, but only one thought echoed in her mind. Daniel was part of an organ trafficking network. The reporter went on, detailing how the syndicate had ruthlessly trafficked humans, orchestrated illegal transplants, and been linked to countless horrifying cases. Mia knew all about crimes like these. She had spent years studying them, some of the most horrific, inhumane acts she had ever come across. To people like that, human life meant nothing. They existed only for profit. But Daniel? He had risked his own life to save her. Mia's thoughts tangled. This didn't make sense. Based on everything she had studied, Daniel should have been like the others, thriving in chaos, making things worse. Yet he had done the opposite. Without a second of hesitation. And not only had he saved her, but he had also betrayed the other inmates. Mia inhaled sharply. Betraying fellow prisoners was like signing your own death sentence. And everyone knew it. The prison administration has placed Daniel in solitary confinement for his safety. But when Mia heard those words, only one thought crossed her mind: this wouldn't last forever. Daniel had just made himself a target among the most dangerous criminals. And now, only one question echoed in Mia's head. Who was Daniel really? Mia was lost in the depths of her mind. She remembered the moment Daniel had tried to tie the tourniquet around her leg, the panic in his eyes, the precision of his movements, and the strange contradiction buried within him. A growing unease spread through her. Something wasn't right. And at that moment, Mia had only one thought: she needed to find the truth. She picked up her phone. The number she had ignored countless times was now the only one she wanted to call: her father. Rang. 2 seconds. 3. 4. Finally, a familiar, anxious voice came from the other end. Mia, are you okay? Mia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I'm fine, Dad. But I need to talk to you. Her father hesitated. Then his voice turned stern. Mia, I told you not to go there. Do you have any idea what you put your mother and me through? There were other projects, other areas you could have specialized in. But you had to choose the most dangerous one. Mia rolled her eyes. He wasn't wrong. But that wasn't the point right now. Dad, stop, she said, forcing herself to be patient. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. But you've seen the news. What do you know about Daniel? Silence. Mia, her father finally said, but his voice was tense. I don't want you to go down this path. Mia took a deep breath, just as she expected. Were you on duty when he was convicted? She asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. This time her father said nothing at all. A few seconds of silence, but to Mia, it was louder than any answer he could have given. Finally he spoke, slowly, carefully. We need to talk in person. Your mother and I will be there in the morning. The call ended with a quiet click. Mia placed her phone back on the table. She knew. Her father was a powerful retired attorney. He had handled high-profile cases for years. And he definitely knew something about this. Now, one thing was clear. Daniel Matthews' case wasn't as simple as the media made it seem. And Mia was determined to uncover everything. Mia knew the moment she opened the door that her father would try to steer the conversation away. But she wasn't backing down. Her eyes burned with determination. Dad, something isn't right. You know it too. Her father sighed deeply, rubbing his face before finally giving in. Yes, he admitted. A close friend of mine was involved in the case against the organization Daniel was supposedly part of. But Daniel wasn't the only one arrested. The investigation led to an entire private hospital's management team and 2 other surgeons being taken in. Mia's curiosity deepened. And Daniel? What did your friend say about him? Her father frowned. He always believed Daniel was hiding something. I found it odd at the time. Mia's mind was racing. Then let's talk to your friend. Her father's patience snapped. Mia, you almost died. And you're still talking about Daniel? Mia had reached her limit too. Yes, but I didn't die, Dad. Because of Daniel, she shouted. Her father fell silent for a moment before reluctantly pulling out his phone and calling his old friend. On the other end of the line, the attorney paused upon hearing the request. From the very beginning, I had a feeling Daniel was forced to take the blame for a crime he didn't commit, he admitted. And what happened to you? It makes me wonder even more. Mia took a steady breath. So what can we do? The attorney hesitated briefly. If you really want the truth, I know a private investigator with powerful connections. He might be able to help. Without hesitation, Mia hired the detective and paid a hefty fee. Her father, though reluctant, was now fully involved. He had spent years as a prestigious attorney, and his connections ran deep. Weeks passed. And then an astonishing truth came to light. Daniel had a daughter. His wife had passed away years ago due to a heart attack. But the death certificate raised suspicions. It had happened while Daniel was still practicing as a surgeon. After his wife's death, social services had taken his daughter away. The private investigator dug deeper and tracked down Daniel's sister, Sarah, who had been living under a different identity. At first, Sarah refused to talk. But in the end, she broke down and confessed. You're asking why I never took in my niece? Because I knew she wouldn't be safe with me. From there, the detective started suspecting that Daniel had been threatened. Then he got his hands on a crucial piece of evidence, security footage from Daniel's trial. And the videos changed everything. A few days before the raid, Daniel was seen storming into an operating room in the middle of surgery, shouting in fury. His face was filled with terror as he tried to stop whatever was happening. But within seconds, several men grabbed him and dragged him out. In another video, his reflection in a glass panel revealed something chilling: he was being threatened. And only hours after that incident, his wife, Maria, mysteriously suffered a fatal heart attack. His daughter was still missing. When the detective showed these findings to Sarah, she trembled, lowering her head. And finally she revealed the full truth. If my brother hadn't taken the blame, they would have killed his daughter. And me too. The detective immediately contacted the police. Because this case wasn't over. The organ trafficking syndicate was still operating. The police reopened their investigation into the network. At the same time, a new appeal was filed to prove Daniel's innocence. A case that had been buried for years was now back in motion. And Mia? She was the only person who could bring Daniel his freedom. Months passed. Long raids, relentless operations, and exhausting court proceedings. It had all led to this moment. And today, after years of captivity, it was Daniel's last day as a prisoner. The courtroom was silent. Daniel stood at the defendant's stand, his head held high, though his eyes carried the weight of deep exhaustion. Finally, the jury announced their verdict. Daniel Matthews found not guilty. A murmur spread through the room. Daniel closed his eyes, taking in a slow, deep breath. He was free. But deep down, the years of being treated like a criminal had left a mark that couldn't be erased so easily. Then the judge spoke again, delivering an additional ruling. Social services required Daniel to stay at a fully equipped health facility for psychological evaluation. If he was deemed mentally fit, he would regain full custody of his daughter. That day, the handcuffs around his wrists were finally removed. As Daniel walked out into the world as a free man, the first person to visit him was Mia. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there holding each other's gaze. And at the same time they both said, "Thank you." Mia had changed Daniel's life. But Daniel had changed Mia's just as much. Daniel was free. He would heal and soon he would reunite with his daughter. As for Mia, she never used to believe in fate. But after everything that had happened, her perspective had shifted. She reshaped her research. Her final thesis now had a completely different title: Methods for Identifying High-Profile Criminals. And when she finished writing it, on the first page, she left a single dedication. This work is dedicated to Daniel Matthews. And life moved forward once more. But nothing would ever be the same again. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You can support us with a super like. Stay tuned for more amazing stories.